It's so nice to have you with us. And, you know, I always look forward to introducing you to somebody new and different and who makes our community an even better place to live. But even more joyful than that is to bring somebody back that does wonderful things. So I have to say, welcome again, Sandra Moran.
Thank you.
And I always tell her that she's writing faster than I can read. I'm slowing down. Give me a break here. So, but she has written a book called All We Lack. And All We Lack is a really, it's just an interesting plot with a lot of characters. And if you haven't read it, I know they can get it on Amazon.
You can get it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Barnes & Noble has, I'm going to ask you if Barnes &
Yep,
Noble has.
and from me as well.
Okay, okay. Well, either Amazon or Barnes & Noble, but I would suggest that if you like a good read, you do this. Now,
Thank you.
we have to discuss this.
Let's
Sandra.
discuss it.
And it's interesting because all we lack is the people seem unrelated, but all of a sudden it begins to come together. And I think that I would be, and I want you to discuss it just a little bit, that we all have ways that we mask and cover our pain.
Yes. Yes, we absolutely do. And I think the characters in All We Lack, one of the things that I try to do with my writing is present flawed characters that are struggling within the everyday, confines of their life. And each of these characters is flawed, but they also are struggling with some very deep-seated hurts, and how they try to navigate their world is...
Well, but I think anybody who reads the book sees something of themselves in at least one of these characters. And it may not be quite as severe, but, we all have pain.
Yes.
Of one kind or another. Now, you have many active characters in this book.
I do. Keeping track of them was challenging.
Well, exactly. So exactly. And it's challenging at first when you start to read it.
Yeah.
But I must say that you laid out the plot so that we didn't lose the thread or drop any stitches.
Good.
Now, how did you start laying out that plot, or with all that? How did you do that?
Well, I am, this may surprise people, but I'm actually very organized when it comes to my writing. And so I created the timeline, and it's based on actual bus routes. So I used...
And it's a rather short timeline, actually.
It is. It's only...
3 or 4 days?
Yeah, 2 days.
2 days.
But it starts out, each of them start out in their individual cities, and then connect slowly but surely over the course of these bus routes. So until they're all on the same bus. And I really use that as a means of anchoring the story. And then from there, I did the character profiles. And
so you did the plot first before you did the characters?
I did the bus route. I knew the names of the characters, and I knew where they were from. And I knew just generally what was going to happen with them. But in terms of fleshing it all out and connecting them together, that really came after I had established how they were going to connect with each other on the
first thing
physical.
you do is decide on the characters?
The first thing I typically do is I decide on the characters. I give them names and ideas to what I want to happen with them. And then after I have the basic plot, then I do very extensive character profiles. For example, Maggie, she had 3 pages of things about her that may not have made it into, several didn't, into the story, but that I knew that informed some of her decisions, some of the ways that she coped with her life.
Just so you don't start talking to them, then people start worrying about you.
Well, and that is a concern.
Yes, it is, yes. Well, how do you create a character? Let's take, just take Maggie.
Okay.
So you thought Maggie happens to be the inheritor of her father's funeral home.
Exactly. I found myself very interested in looking at a female character who was placed in a situation where because in the past, men have more often than not been the funeral directors.
That's right.
And so what I wanted to do was put her in that position, and she assumed the business from her father, although the father wanted it to go to her brother.
And he said,
He said no. He was completely repulsed by the funeral industry, and by his father as well, because of certain things that happen outside of that. So I began with her, but then, you know, why was she so eager to please? What happened in her past that made her want to take this on? Did she really like it? Did she not? You know, what motivated her? And then from there, I fleshed out just characteristics, things that she liked, things that she didn't like, reasons why she would hide who she was.
So you write, basically, you write many stories before you write the main story.
Absolutely. On the wall in my office, I have this enormous timeline across one entire wall that has, it's broken down not just by what's going to happen, but by each of the characters. And I, for example, for Bug, the 10-year-old boy, I actually traveled to Philadelphia, and I went to his neighborhood, and I took pictures of the house that I would want him to live in, and I traced his route. I went to his school, and so I had those pictures up there as well so that I could refer to them in maps. And I mean, I put a lot of time into the front end of it.
Well, because the back end doesn't come out well if you don't do that.
It really doesn't. Words to live by.
You also contrast backgrounds. For example, you have Emma, and she's a very old line Bostonian, and then you have Helen, who is the child of Polish immigrants, and they are friends. So you bring two disparate people together.
Yeah.
And how you do that, I think, is very interesting because it's sort of seamless. I mean,
Thank you.
I don't.
Thank you. Well, you look at the people that are in your life, or that are in our lives, and they're really, particularly with social media, from all different, you know, backgrounds and had all these different experiences, but they share one or two things in common that draw them together. And with Helen and Emma, it was, you know, working for this same company that eventually puts them into each other's sphere, and then from there it just.
But you got to be careful that you don't drop any stitches because it leaves somebody hanging in the wrong spot.
It does, and that was something that I had to be very, very careful about. And I had the story mapped out in as if it were a dance that were choreographed, and in some ways I guess it was.
It is,
yes.
And I think, you know, that's a sort of an interesting analogy, because I think when you read a book, if it's not choreographed well, you either quit or slog through it. And if it is choreographed well, you just keep reading. And I you know, I think that's the way it should be.
Well, thank you. And I hope that what I tried to do was make each of the characters' stories interesting enough that you would become invested in them as you're reading their chapter and be almost disappointed when it ended, but then pick up with someone, with the next person, and you know, then become invested in their story.
Well, and the interesting thing is, as you read along, then you begin to pick up the threads that are common among them. And there are some common threads among them in a little different form and manifestation, perhaps, but they are there. And I'm wondering if you, to me, the problem is their personal problem is put forward. And sometimes the first step is acceptance. It's my problem, and that's just the way I am. And then they get angry about it. And then sometimes a hate boils up. I mean, to me, it's a progression. And then sometimes a rebellion occurs, and they have to make some decisions. And often that results in change. Now, that change can be either positive or negative, but there is a change that takes place. And I'm wondering, where does guilt fit in?
I think guilt probably could be a fifth character in this book, because each of them had a tremendous amount of guilt about a poor decision or series of decisions that they made, whether it was Jimmy, and I mean, they all have a tremendous amount of guilt, including Bug, the 10-year-old, who really had nothing to feel guilty about, though he did.
Well, he did. His mother is a mess. She's a drug addict and a drunk, and he thinks, well, if she didn't want me, and if she hadn't had me, then she wouldn't have had these problems, you know. And she was horrible to him.
She was. I mean, the nickname, Bug, is a horrible nickname to call your son that, when, you know, it's, each of them, I think Bug's guilt was probably, in some ways, the most poignant, because he was as much a victim as anything else.
He's young.
But he's very young, and you know, in their own way, I think each of them was also, each of the characters were broken as well.
Oh, they are.
And
but not permanently necessarily.
not at all. And yeah. I think that through the course of what I wanted to have was a physical journey that had an emotional journey laid on top of that. That we saw a slight transformation in them. For example, Jimmy. You know, I feel like he comes to a realization that he can't continue to do the same things that
he
has been doing, exactly.
Well, Jimmy's kind of an interesting person because he was an EMT and hurt his back and got hooked on pain pills. And his life went from really he was a professional. He had a good life and a profession, and with
that he was good at. Apparently,
that he was very good at.
I say apparently like I don't know. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the pills were not a downward spiral, but a straight downward drop. And so he became not much better than a street person.
No, not at all. And he had a rough childhood as well. He had a father who was, his mother left and his father was an alcoholic. But he really did try to raise himself up.
And he did do that.
But again, you know, the prescription addiction just really took him back down to a place where, because he had such low self-esteem anyway, I felt like the pills only enabled that.
Well, I believe that as well. But I thought the interesting thing was, in his abject misery, he created a person who he would like to be.
Yes.
And sometimes in varying degrees, many of us do that and get away with it.
Well, and again, with social media, it's so easy for you to be anyone that you want.
And that's what he did. But often, we all know people that have, as we say, reinvented themselves. And his was a very pathetic kind of sham. And it was very, very sad.
Well, and he tried to convince himself that this was the man he would have been or could have been had things been different.
I know.
And that was a deception in and of itself, because he could never be.
Well, and a deception like that never leads to success. It only leads to more failure, which is what. I think the best 3 years of Bug's life, he was only 10 years old, were the 3 years he spent with his grandmother. His mother just kind of left him in the house by himself. The neighbors reported him. And his grandmother, who was not very young and not very well, took him, but he lived with her 3 years. And I say that when Mrs. Talbot died, that was his grandmother, it seems to me that you started to pull these characters together.
That was very much a nexus for a couple of the characters. Death again, as is common in my books.
Yeah, you're just a happy little elf.
I really am. People who know me would be surprised to know just how much death there is in my or probably not.
I'm not surprised.
I don't know. Yes.
No, yeah.
But yes, her death brought several of them together, because that was kind of the linchpin to bring Jimmy and Bug together, and then that led to the injury. I mean, so yeah, it was a very telling moment for many of them.
You see, that to me was the seminal event where you started to pull those strings in together to the center.
Well, and at first it's unclear how these people are even connected to each other.
It is.
But then, hopefully, layer by layer and bit by bit, you see how that happens. It's a lot like that, the 6 degrees of separation, or the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, where you can trace
Well, it's
everybody.
like an onion. You just keep
Exactly.
Taking
Exactly.
those. Yeah. Well, I just thought, and they're all, the bus is certainly a conveyance for travel, but it's also, to me, a symbol, because they're all running away from something.
They are.
And so the bus is the conveyance not only to get someplace where they're going, but to convey them from their flight.
Exactly. Well, and it's a conveyance. They're running away from something, but I think each of them also, in some small way, believes that they're running to something.
I do.
Because Bug is going to his aunt, Maggie is going to Sarah.
Yes.
Helen is going to meet the fabulous Dr. James. And
yes, who has Jimmy is the one that's created this false persona that Helen has fallen in love with. Oh dear.
Yeah.
Remember, there was and a couple of characters just kind of pop in and say something that's germane to the whole subject. And on this bus was a man named William, and he said to Helen, everything goes back to fear. Fear of being found out, fear of being abandoned, fear of the unknown. What made you put him in there? And because I think they are all afraid.
Oh, I think, first of all, I do think fear is what motivates us a lot of the time, just generally as humans. Whether, again, it's fear of failure, fear of how people are going to regard you. But Helen had such a challenging experience with religion that I wanted her to have an interaction with someone that would express, would lay it out there, but who also was, because he's a former pastor, that would give her a different experience with belief, and maybe on some very, very small level show a little bit of hope.
Well, it's interesting because when I reflected upon William, it reminded me that in the Bible, angels were messengers of God, and in fact, they didn't even have names until the book of Daniel, because they didn't want, whoever wrote did not want the angel's name to take away from the glory of God. And so they would bring messages back and forth. And so I thought of William as something of an angelic messenger to bring something to Helen, because he said it to her at the right time, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm one of those people who really believes that there is no such thing as coincidence, that, without going into a long discussion about spirituality and belief,
We'll say that for another day.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I do think that, let me rephrase that. I think if you're open to hearing something or need to hear it, the message will be there for you. You will be able to take from an experience what you need at that moment.
I think absolutely true, but the operative word here is open.
Exactly.
You have to be open to what's around you and what you hear, and when that change comes, Maggie said it best. She said, if I'm going to make changes, it might as well start now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we do often come to that point,
Mm-hmm.
that the change has to be made, but it takes a lot of guts to make those changes sometimes. And Helen says, see, they begin to talk. Mm-hmm. And my little circle of different feelings comes into play. And Helen says, I can't just keep trudging through life. Mm-hmm. She said, I need a complete change, and I want to start over. And the next sentence is really telling, and she said, I need to take a risk. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it too, to be open, to understand what's going on within you, and the willingness to take that risk.
Absolutely, but then that also ties back into the fear.
Exactly.
And it's all very, very much linked together, I think, much as the characters are.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But you show them starting to make that change. Mm-hmm. I have to ask you this. In the book, Helen is on the bus and she's brought a book with her. And it says you talk about a book set in Chicago in the 30s that she wants to read. Is that Letters Never Sent?
It is.
I knew it.
It is.
That's the other one. That's the other one that Sandra wrote that we talked about it, if you remember.
Yeah.
And I knew it.
Yeah.
I caught you.
You did catch me.
Let me ask you this. Is there always, that was just a sort of a sidebar, I had to say
no,
something
but that's
to you.
a really great question, and you're one of the few people that actually caught that.
Naturally.
Of course.
Yes, yes.
Of course.
But I have to ask you this, and we've talked about she can't keep trudging through life, she needs to make a change, you need to take a risk, got to start now. Do you believe that there's always a seminal event causing that now?
Yes, I do. I really do.
See, I think you did that in your book.
Well, and it's one of those, I believe, and I did the same thing in Letters Never Sent, where there was just an event that, just that single moment where everything changes, where everything has to change. And in this instance, for each of them, there was that seminal moment. But I do believe that, not only just from personal experience, but I believe that in life as well.
I do.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be an atomic explosion.
No,
See,
it could be
and I
something
think-
as simple
yeah.
that just completely changes your paradigm.
Yeah. And I think also you, Jimmy says, well, see, there are just little sentences that come out, and on page 124, Eddie says, he's another one that kind of pops up.
Yeah.
He says, well, everybody's hiding something. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. And Jimmy says, well, and in another spot, if they could only just see the real me. Mm-hmm. See, the real me is in here, and it doesn't get out very well, except in that persona that he manufactures.
Exactly. I think Jimmy really believes that he has so much. He has so many problems with self-esteem, and I think that in terms of creating this persona, this really is the person that he would like to be if he could, but I don't think he has the ability to. I don't think that's inherently who he is. Yeah. But I do find it interesting that he feels like his most authentic self is imagined.
Well, and see, there's another key, because when you live in a fantasy world, nothing's going to get better.
No.
When you face the reality of it, as some of them did, then it begins to change. Yeah. So it says here, and this is Jimmy. And Jimmy does finally come to some sort of a realization. And he says, you can only blame your parents, Diane said to him, you can only blame your parents and your past for so long. And at some point, he thought, he says, I've got to step up and I have to make amends. And he had to be honest with Helen. Mm-hmm. And so you see, even though he lived in a fantasy world, it did finally dawn on him that reality hits. Mm-hmm. which I thought was the denouement is coming. And so, yeah, and I think that's sort of interesting, because you try to salvage whatever's left of them after they have been, some of them have been very badly broken. And you keep trying to, there's always that salvageability in these things.
There is, and I think he pulls it out at the end. Maybe a little too late, but he tries to do the right thing.
Well, he does, and I think they all do. They all do.
Yeah.
They're going toward something, and again, the bus is going towards something for all. Do you have a favorite character in here?
I really like Maggie. I really like
You
Maggie.
do? Yes.
I have.
Well, she's a strong woman.
She's a strong woman, and just the whole
She's the funeral home opera.
yeah. And I think I enjoyed her character so much just because there was a certain depth to her in terms of death that resonated with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, she, and you know, there's always, you salvage them. There's always something within them that's good, and that we can say that's a good person, basically a good person. Well, there's, you never know who you are unless you shed who you pretend to be in essay. And perhaps the very last sentence in your book, do you remember what it is?
I don't.
Okay, well, let me,
Please.
I'm not sure I can find it here, but there it is. She had no idea, Maggie again, she had no idea what the future would bring. But
Sarah.
Sarah, I'm sorry. But she was hopeful. And in the end, wasn't hope all that anyone had.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of sums it up, because as long as we maintain that ability to hope.
Yeah, it's the one thing that I would argue could get you through anything, is the hope that just tomorrow it's going to be better. If I just
That's right.
hang on.
If you just hang on another minute or two.
Yeah.
And I found Aristotle Onassis said we have to learn to sail in high winds. And I think that's true too. And Jonas Salk said something. I had two and I couldn't choose between, so I'm bringing you both. Jonas Salk says, hope lies in dreams, in imagination, and in the courage of those who dare to make dreams a reality. And I would say to you, All We Lack is a really good book, and you've done it again, Sandra Moran. So I await the next one, which is The Harvey Girls.
Is on the Harvey Girls,
Yes.
historical fiction.
So we'll see you again soon. It's always so nice.